Hey there, it's esquared photography. I'm Erin.
And I'm Emily, and we are here to keep things simple and fun.
Are you new to family photography, or maybe you're just struggling with manual mode? Well, we're here to give away our secrets on the settings we use for our family photography sessions.
Also, make sure to watch all the way through because we have a special treat just for you.
We promise to have you entering into your next family session feeling confident and at ease with our advice today.
For the best photography tips and tricks, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit the bell for notifications for future videos.
All right, so we want to talk about our favorite lenses that we take along to our family sessions. So we like to bring a 50mm Nikon, an 85 for shooting with maybe just one or two people in the photo, and then we also like to bring a 35 just in case.
You don't need to bring all of those different lenses. To be honest, we probably 95% of the time shoot with our 50mm for families.
All right, so we're gonna dive right into aperture, ISO, and shutter speed. And if you still aren't familiar with those three different things and on camera settings, make sure you watch our video on all about camera settings where we talk about those three things in more detail. So we're gonna start by talking about aperture. So at a family session, when we're thinking about aperture, or you might hear it called f-stop, when we're shooting with 1 to 2 people, so maybe we're shooting an individual kid, or maybe we're shooting just sisters, whatever it might be, we typically shoot at an f-stop of anywhere from about 2.8 to 4, but typically on that lower end of the f-stop, the smaller number. As we start adding more people and doing the full family photo, so anywhere from about 3 to 6 people, we shoot at an f-stop of 4 or higher. We like to stay as low as we possibly can, remembering that lets the most light in, but we also need to increase it the more people we have in the photo. And we're going to talk about a couple of things to go along with that in a second here. And then if there are more than 6 people in the photo, we really crank her up anywhere from about 4.5 to an f-stop of 7.
So one reason that you have to sometimes have a higher f-stop number with a smaller group of people is if you put them in different planes or different rows, you need to be able to get a crisp image of everybody. So Erin and I are next to each other right now, as you can see. We could shoot this at a very low f-stop. Now let's say we change and she's further back. Then you would want to do a higher f-stop so we can get her crisp and myself crisp. Okay, so now let's jump into ISO. So ISO depends on the time of day, obviously. We typically do our sessions 2 hours or so before sunset, so we have that nice golden hour light. Typically, we start our ISO at a 200. I would say 90% of the time shoot at an ISO of 200 because of the light that we're shooting in. If it starts to get a little bit dark, we'll bump it up to 400. And the darker it gets, the higher our ISO will have to raise.
All right, and so now let's jump into shutter speed. So we've talked about aperture, we've talked about ISO, now let's talk about shutter speed. So one rule of thumb that we always like to have when we think about shutter speed is we double the lens length. For example, if we're using our 50mm, we're gonna shoot at higher than a 1/100 almost all the time. We will never go lower than 100, but it's usually higher than that. If we're shooting with our 85mm lens, we go 1/170 at our absolute lowest, but again, we typically go higher than that because with families, we know that there is movement. So kid movement is going to equal a high shutter speed. Now, if you see that the images are getting too dark, and you can't adjust your shutter speed because it's going too low or whatever it might be, that's when you need to think about altering your ISO and bumping that up a little bit.
Put a comment in the comments below about what you struggle with the most, ISO, shutter speed, or aperture.
Okay, so just to recap, when we go to a family session, here's what we typically do. We turn our camera on, bonus. We first start by setting our ISO, again, typically 200, okay? And then depending on what grouping we're starting with, so family sessions are a little bit trickier because you need to remember to constantly be changing your aperture. So if we're gonna start with the whole family, we'll set our aperture to that. If we're gonna start with just the siblings or just individual kids, we'll start with our aperture a little bit different than we would as the whole family. So once we have our ISO set and we have our aperture set, that's when we are adjusting our shutter speed. And we adjust our shutter speed throughout the whole session to give us the right exposure and things that we want in our photos.
One last bonus thing that we always like to use at a photo session is something called an Expost. And we will have the link for the Expost that we buy in the description below. So take a look at that. This is something that you don't need to have, but this is something we use. And we use it to correct our white balance, so the skin tones of the clients that we are shooting. This can also be done in editing in Lightroom, but we like to use the Expost because it shortens our editing time a lot.
Again, if this isn't enough for you and you need a little bit more detail to take it a little bit further, don't forget to watch our video all about camera settings on ISO, aperture, and shutter speed.
One other thing that can be a little bit stressful and confusing at times is where you focus when you have a group of 4 or more people. So let's take a look at this first picture here. Where would we focus? In this picture, because there's different people are on different planes, we're gonna have a higher f-stop for sure, rather than if they were in a straight line. But in this picture, we would focus on the little boy in the middle in the front. He would be our focus point because he is closest to the camera and he's in the center. For this next picture here, where they're all walking pretty much in a straight line, we are going to focus on one of the center individuals. So for this one, we probably focused on the little girl. So when they're in a straight line, you don't have to have as high of an f-stop number, but we're gonna focus on one of the center people in that line.
So that was just a little additional bonus, not necessarily camera settings, but we wanted to give you a little bit extra in the video.
All right, so now that you know what our settings are usually at for our family photo sessions, we have something else to help you so you can feel 100% prepared for your next session.
So you can see in the comments below that we have a link to a freebie for you. This freebie will include a little checklist as far as camera settings go, but it's also going to include some practice worksheets for you that's going to force you to get outside, shoot in manual mode, and play around with all of those different settings. And we also have added a little bonus with an answer key.
You can find this free download in the description below. If you could for us right now, please leave a comment down below with one question you have related to shooting family photos.
If this video was helpful, make sure to like, subscribe, and share it with a friend so we know to make more videos just like this one.
And make sure to stay tuned for our next video, and we will see you next time.